Hi, it's Dr. Crone again. In the last video, we discussed state courts, and that's one aspect of the judicial process in the states. In this video, we'll learn about the criminal justice system in the states, which is linked to the courts, but is also really a function of the state's executive branch. As we learned back in Polls 1100, the vast majority of criminal cases in the United States are adjudicated through the state courts. Most things you and I consider to be a crime, like murder, robbery, and assault, are all illegal under state laws. Therefore, most criminals are found guilty in state courts and sentenced to punishment in state correctional facilities. Crime is largely a state problem, not a national one. The high incarceration rate is a prominent and growing problem in the modern United States. The U.S. has the highest incarceration rate in the world, higher even than authoritarian countries like China or Russia. This pie chart shows that the vast majority of those prisoners, over 80% of them, are incarcerated in state prisons and local jails. County jails are used for two basic purposes. First, to imprison accused individuals who haven't had a trial yet and either were not granted bail or can't afford to pay their bail. Remember that these folks have not yet been found guilty by the court system, but they're imprisoned anyway, awaiting trial. The second group of people in county jail are those serving short sentences, usually several months, for nonviolent offenses. State prisons, on the other hand, house convicted prisoners who are serving longer sentences. Federal prisons, the gold slice of the pie, have a smaller population, and the majority of those are nonviolent white-collar offenders. Youth offenders, the purple slice of the pie, fall entirely under state control. All of this incarceration costs states lots and lots of money. Over $80 billion per year is spent in the United States on corrections. Incarceration isn't the only way that states and the federal government carry out sentences. Probation and parole are two types of community supervision that allow convicted criminals to serve part or all of their sentence in the community under the control of the state. You're free, but you're not really free. Probation refers to community supervision instead of prison or jail time. This is often used for first-time nonviolent offenders. As you can see, more than half of convicted lawbreakers in the U.S. are on probation. The other type of community supervision is called parole. Parole is granted to offenders who have already served part of their sentence in prison. They finish their sentence under community supervision. Parole and probation are cheaper alternatives to imprisonment, and as we'll see, many states are increasing these programs as cost-cutting measures. State laws and law enforcement changes are the main causes of the huge increase in incarceration since the 1980s. As you can see from this graph, prior to the 1970s, the levels of incarceration in the country were fairly low and fairly stable. But in the mid-1970s, the U.S. had a shift in political culture and public opinion that involved two related issues: growing concern about the effects of illegal drugs and growing fears of violent crime. President Nixon launched the nation's first war on drugs in the early 1970s, and President Reagan in the 1980s intensified this. Both the federal government and states developed stricter drug laws during this time, aimed not only at drug sales, but also at individual drug possession and use. This accounted for the beginning of the steep incline in the graphs. Then in the 1990s, major crime waves in cities pushed both the federal government and state governments to enact tough-on-crime laws by increasing sentences for many offenses and instituting mandatory minimum sentences for certain crimes. Most critically, under the leadership of President Clinton, the federal government and states passed 3 strikes and you're out laws that sentenced offenders to life in prison after they were convicted of a 3rd felony. Suddenly, federal and state prisons were full of offenders serving life sentences for much less serious crimes than had been happening previously. You can also see from this chart a drop-off in incarcerations in the early 2000s. This drop-off was motivated by state reforms designed to lower the cost of imprisonment. That's the topic of the PBS movie you'll view, and also of our Activity 4. More on that later in this video. This graph shows that drug offenses make up about 20% of all incarcerations in the United States. The majority of these are for drug possession, not sales. You'll also hear a lot more about drug policy in the PBS video. Young people under the age of 18 who are incarcerated are most likely to be held for nonviolent offenses. Only 25% of incarcerated youth have committed a crime against another person, such as assault. Many youth are held instead on technical violations, which can be things like skipping school or breaking curfew. As you can see, there are also significant numbers of young people being held in the immigration system who have committed no crime other than entering the U.S. illegally. A very troubling aspect of the American criminal justice system is the racial inequity in the system. African Americans are far more likely to experience arrest, conviction, and confinement than are whites. Both Blacks and Latinos are overrepresented in the prison population, while whites are underrepresented. Beginning in the early 2000s, and especially since 2010, many states have wrestled with the problem of mass incarceration. This is partly motivated by shifts in public opinion that have started to see mass incarceration as an ethical problem. But it has been driven even more by the need of states to cut the skyrocketing costs of incarceration. There have been a number of reforms that have been attempted. One common reform has been decriminalization of minor drug possession. Decriminalization means that technically something is still against the law, but you won't get arrested for it. That's now true in Ohio for possession of small amounts of marijuana. A second reform has been to shorten the lengths of sentences for many crimes. Another interesting reform has been to increase the amount of money needed to be stolen for a theft to be considered a felony. A felony is a more serious crime than a misdemeanor and usually involves a prison sentence. Many states set the threshold for a theft to be considered a felony back in the 1960s, when $100 or $200 was considered much more than it is today. Lots of states have updated these threshold numbers so that people who steal small amounts of money serve only jail time or probation instead of time in prison. The last two types of reforms are both related to shortening or eliminating prison sentences whenever possible. Increasing chances for early release for good behavior is one strategy. Prisoners can earn time off their sentences for activities such as completing a high school or college degree in prison, or for attending prison drug rehab or anger management programs. Another reform is to allow more convicted criminals to serve their time in the community, either under probation or parole. All of these reforms are designed to save the state money because community supervision is much cheaper than incarceration. You'll be researching whether your state has tried any of these reforms in our Activity 4, which is due on Sunday. The next step should be for you to watch the prison state video. There's a link on Blackboard to the PBS streaming version. We would have watched the first 30 minutes of the video in class, so you need to watch at least that much. Of course, if you want to watch more, that's great. In fact, I'll give you 5 extra credit points if you watch the whole thing and email me your takeaways from the rest of the video. FYI, for students who have a personal connection with the prison system, this video can be difficult to watch. If you would prefer not to watch it and would like an alternative assignment, just email me and I'll be happy to give you one. Good luck with your work this week. Stay in touch.